organization types, right? Municipalities and airports, universities, hospitals, utilities, hotels, etc. So the one thing we all kind of have in common, especially in business, is networks, right? It's how we, you know, live and breathe anymore. We have some sort of network behind the scenes. Even at home, we have small networks. In our businesses, whether it's a small business or very large business, there's usually some network infrastructure behind the scenes that somebody needs to know something about. Sometimes those are managed infrastructures, sometimes they're self-managed, sometimes they're a mix of both. But either way, sometimes documentation can be helpful, and I do say sometimes because maybe not always. So, why do we document? We partly to get answers to questions, right? Um, getting a level of detail about our infrastructure that can help us out from in day to day, right? So we look at things as what exists, where is it, how's it connected, who owns it from a networking standpoint. And then you consider things like your audience. Why do you document? Well, because you might have an audience that requires it or needs it. Maybe it's the CTO or CIO or the leadership at the company. Maybe it's engineering or the knock and just field workers in general. Or there's other reasons too. You might have to fulfill some requirements because you do a lot of processing of data, and they may require you to have some network documentation. Could be anything from your insurance company. Because you are saying that you have a secure network, they want to know at least to have some documentation and some other things around that. So, you build these types of things to go with it. So, what to document? That leads us down the road of, we talk about network documentation, but ultimately, what is it that we want to document? Um, so again, that's going to lead to really my next slide, which I'm going to talk quite a bit about, which is the scope of network documentation. So when you say we need documentation or we need to document our network, that's all well and good, but you really have to define what that means scope wise. I mean, ultimately down the road, you may be like, hey, I want to document everything. I want to have a complete as built environment in my network documentation. Um, so an as built would be how is everything basically physically connected together in some tool that I can refer to and understand what my network looks like without having to actually go out in the field necessarily. But that's a lift that most people can't do, certainly not in the short term. So we have to look at the scope. What is it that we want to do with our network documentation project? So uh, one thing we look at is business decisions, and that's usually based around what I like a lot of people refer to. It's about the pain, right? What is the pain that we have that we want to try and solve with network documentation? That can mean different things to different people. It can be things like capacity planning from the standpoint of fiber cables and strands, capacity planning around racks, rack elevations, capacity planning around things like power. So you look at your infrastructure, you look at, hey, where are we having certain troubles, and is the network documentation going to help us with respect to that? And if it is, then that's kind of your core focus you start with. If it's capacity around fiber cables and strands, then let's focus on that to start with. Yeah, of course you might build it out over time, but we need to define the scope of the project, and that I think is very important when you start a project because that also will sort of dictate who you're going to get involved into the project. Because if it's fiber, maybe it's a smaller list of folks that you are really going to be dealing with internally as far as the documentation project goes. So you sort of define that scope and you say, okay, this is what we want to do. It's inside plan, outside plan, or even just logical drawings. What do we want to do? Let's define that scope. Because that leads to other questions and other things you got to think about, which is things like the boundary. The boundary are things like if I'm a university, my boundary might be my campus. Is it all campuses or one campus? Is it all the buildings or just a couple core buildings? Things like that. That's what we kind of term boundary. It doesn't have to be physical. It doesn't have to be like a map although it sort of makes sense when you talk about something like a university campus. Maps make sense because you have campus buildings and things like that. But it could be other boundaries. It might be boundaries like if you're doing logical drawings, maybe it just has to do with routers and switches and core infrastructure around those types of things, or VLANs or subnets. Again, just depending on how you want to define it. With respect to things like fiber outside plant, then that boundary again could be a map. Usually with outside plant, you're dealing with maps because you want to show fiber, sort of how it traverses. You don't have to do that, but that's usually pretty common from that standpoint. But also the boundary is things like not just the sites or the buildings, but also you start to get into a hierarchy, although the tool you pick may not be a hierarchical tool, and it doesn't necessarily have to be. Uh, but you might be thinking in terms of buildings and floors and rooms, routes, services like we have up here, domains. What's in scope for the project? What we're thinking in terms of, those that again, what I defined as a boundary. And then there's asset classes, manholes and handholds. Are we defining circuits and power, those sorts of things? So with outside plant, my experience has been a lot of folks, what they really want to do are the fiber cables, usually the path that the cable follows, possibly the conduit the cable is in. If we do splicing, we want to know probably the splice case that's being used. Where is the splice case? Is it a manhole or a handhole, or is it above ground? Is it on a pole? Those types of things. So that's some of the asset classes, especially with like outside plant. When you look at inside plant, it might be switches and routers and racks, pretty common. But what about cabling? Those types of things. So you start to ask your questions again. That's why I'm talking about scope so much, because it's very important to what you're documenting in your project as a whole. If you want to be successful, you want to scope it. You don't want to scope it too large, too broad. I think you will. It'll be really tough to fulfill or get started, honestly. So connectivity depth, that kind of speaks back to like cabling usually. When we talk in terms of cabling, do I care about cabling, right? I mean, if I'm doing a rack elevation project, maybe at this point the cabling doesn't even matter. Maybe this is really about capacity of racks, showing where the racks are, or the wiring closets, maybe knowing where those are physically, maybe. Because again, I'm not saying you need to have a deep hierarchy for all these things. It's more, again, goes back to the scope of where you're starting. But connectivity can lead to, you can say that you want to get down to strand level for your fiber cables, but that can be tougher than it might seem if you don't really have the data. And that leads us sort of to source systems. Which records feed the model, right? So when we get into network documentation, one of the things, when we're speaking with folks is we want to talk to you about your data that you have. What type of data do you have that might be helpful to the project? And you want to think pretty broad on this. Just because you don't have network documentation or you don't have a network monitoring system or an asset management system doesn't mean you don't have data, because you might. That might be helpful, right? So anything from if you have like a campus type environment, things like your buildings, maybe you do have buildings in another tool, maybe Esri or something along those lines. Maybe you have it in a spreadsheet. So you look at your spreadsheets, maybe you can use that data to populate buildings again, if you're trying to document buildings and physical hierarchy. So you want to look at all these different options you have for data. Spreadsheets are usually the most popular that I deal with, with customers. They usually have some sort of spreadsheet of data, whether it's for rack elevations or for inside plant, outside plant, whatever it happens to be. Usually spreadsheets are pretty common. Network monitoring systems to a certain extent, because of something like let's say a SolarWinds, where you're collecting data about switches and routers. Now, if those aren't part of the scope of the project, then of course that doesn't probably matter, except they may have data that has to do with the physical locations of objects. So maybe from that data, you can derive pretty quickly all your, again, going back to buildings or floor plans or sorry, buildings or manholes and that kind of thing. So don't just discount the data. Think about all the data that might be in that system, because a lot of these systems do house a lot of data that might be useful for your project. So you want to kind of go through that list, of your checklist in your head, or work with your internal folks and think about where data is coming from. Visio can in times be a good source of data. Maybe it's not um, going to give you everything you need, but if you are keeping your Visios up to date, that can be a good way to grab information and bring over, because Visio can be typically even converted to other data sets, something like Excel, or I think they have, save as options where you can take that data and kind of move it over. CMDBs, systems that have like REST APIs. So when you start to look at tools, whether it's our tool or all the other tools you're going to go look at when you're doing network documentation project, one of the things you want to look at typically is there an integration or a way to integrate and pull data from other systems if there's a system out there you want to integrate with. Usually that's done with REST APIs. Um, we provide REST APIs for people who want to kind of connect to our software and control it programmatically, and most vendors provide that as well. I mean, if you look at something like ServiceNow, that extensive REST APIs. So you can take advantage of those and create connections to those systems and pull data. So that's, again, one of those things you want to put down and think about. Like if you do have a system you want to connect to, can it be connected to? Can we leverage that data? That's where you get into automation for network documentation. The source data sources that you can connect to and automate your documentation, that's pretty key to what it is you're doing. So CMDBs, things like Remedy, ServiceNow, asset management systems, that sort of thing. Monitoring tools that do SNMP discovery, whether it's built into the tool or whether you're connected to a tool where you're already doing network monitoring and management, that can be sometimes helpful. Usually in outside plant, it's not as helpful because outside plant has to do with more with patch panels and splice cases, which aren't really discoverable things. So other things to think about though, notes, Word documents, again, Excel sheets, really kind of any data set. Now that you've got the advent of AI, a lot of those things, that data that you have, you can technically ingest and have it turn into text documentation or CSV files. Most tools, I think you'll find, have a mechanism for importing data from CSV at least. Um, I know we do. I mean, um, it's a it's very powerful to be able to do like Excel imports and things like that, because most people know how to use Excel. It's one of those tools like, okay, everybody learns some some form of Excel or spreadsheets. So most people can, take Excel data and then convert it to a format and then import for most tools out there. So keep in mind the source data. Don't just think in terms of like one or two systems. Try and see what's out there. See what's in your environment you can take advantage of to shorten your the amount of work that you have to put into your network documentation project. The time it takes to do network documentation all really comes back to sources of data. If you don't have any documentation, you're like, oh, I want to do an outside plant project. Outside plant can be very difficult if you have to get down into manholes and things like that, where you're trying to document systems or fiber cables and conduits that there's no documentation for. That, from what I hear, because I've never had to do that personally, dealing with customers and so on, that's not typically an easy lift. There's some work involved there. So just keep that in mind. I mean, you can hire people to do audits, or you can do that yourselves, obviously internally. So there is that. And then validation. If you have a scope of work and you're saying this is what we want our deliverable to be, then at some point you go, okay, let's start to validate what we're doing and have people kind of sign off on it. Validation is important in process. So if you are, especially when you get into things like audits or you're sending people out to collect data, hey, I want to collect data about my rack and stack, my data centers. So I'm going to do an inventory of a cabinet or some of my cabinets. Don't spend 2 weeks doing that without testing your data. No matter what system you're putting data into, grab data, build that process, import the data, test what you're doing with the system that you purchased. If you purchased a system, you might just be doing Excel sheets or something. That's fine too, but start to validate some of that data and make sure that the process is working for you. You don't want to have to go back, especially when it's hard to get the data, like with respect to like outside plant, where honestly, with customers that literally have hundreds of miles of fiber and conduits and other things, and you can't just send somebody out. Oh, we forgot that. Hey, let's go get that data. It could take them 3 or 4 hours to drive to some location, right? So you guys know that better than me. So keep that in mind with perspective validation rules. So I spent a bit of time on the scope thing. Why? Because scope is important. Thinking through these things is important for your project. You want to obviously get network documentation kicked off and get things done. Just do it somewhat methodically in a process, and again, don't bite off more than you can chew, so to speak. Stick with the scope that makes the most sense for the pain you're trying to help resolve or at least minimize. So, and again, that can be sort of anything from having better documentation for troubleshooting, for asset management, for capacity planning, and so on. So all those things are important. That's why we do network documentation, not because we like to do it. So where do you start? Well, scope. I put that at the top of my list. That's where you start. You start with your scope. Um, the next thing you're going to do is, of course, research. I'm doing outside plant. So you go and you search for outside plant tools. You do Google searching for outside plant or fiber cable management, or there's all kinds of lists of words you can go and just play around in Google and see what kind of pops up and get vendors. I know there's tools out there where you can get top 10 lists of things, or companies that sort of do quadrants and all that type of stuff. So however you go about determining or finding software, go start to Google it. The other one is AI it. Looks like Alit, but it is AI. You guys are familiar with AI. I'm sure you have AI tools you use in house. So start doing some searching and seeing what's out there, right? What do people do? Find vendors, right? Vendors can be helpful too, where, of course, we were trying to sell you a product, but at the same time, we often will provide information, a webinar like this. Other vendors, I'm sure, do webinars where they'll give you some information, white papers, right? We have white papers on our website that you can go check out, and some of those speak specific to like university campuses, right? How did such and such use our tool in this environment? And also when you get into vendors, I mean, you can just, talk to them outside of the demos and just, see who else might be using the software and what the experience level is with your particular organization type, right? So just keep that in mind. Um, yeah, we posted some success stories in there in the chat. Demos, right? Of course, you're going to take some demos. You're going to call people up, and you want to get some demos of the product. Hey, what do you guys do? Um, you know, we I'll just give you an example. We typically will have like a 15-minute call with you, right? We'll just say, hey, this is what we do, give you a high level overview of the tool, decide if it makes sense maybe to have a more extensive demo with your team, right? So you're not investing a whole lot of time on the front end. We're not expecting you to spend hours with us or anything like that. That's just how we work. Other people might do things differently. You pick and choose the vendor and do your demos and kind of go from there. Now it is helpful to kind of come with some questions. We do like questions when we do demos. So any vendor you speak with or do demos with, come with a few questions. It doesn't have to be a written list that you send. It doesn't have to be a huge sheet of requirements and things like that. It's just generally speaking, get an idea of the tool and what it does and just get a feel for, the demo. We like doing a live demo, show up the software and things like that. So you take a look. Other things to consider when you are going down this path of network documentation, if you are using a tool that you're going to purchase, think about the costs. Do you want a cloud solution? Do you want the vendor hosting the solution for you, where you're going to log in like a lot of systems are now, SaaS, cloud, whatever it's called. You log in and use your password and you're doing your work, right? Or do you want on-premise? So is there a solution out there that's on premise? A lot of solutions are not on premise anymore. We do allow on premise still. So those are things you look into. And then what's the licensing model? How do they charge? Is it per object? Is it per user? Is it seats? Is it whatever? So and then there's other things too, like do you have to install software? Is there plugins and all these things? I think most people don't necessarily have that anymore. I can't speak to all the vendors out there though, but we're pretty much all web based for what we do. So feature functionality. After you do some demos, you do some reading, you'll start to understand feature functionality that you might be looking for. What's sort of the critical stuff and what's the nice to have stuff. And I'm not saying again you need to develop a whole list of that, but just in the back of your mind have maybe a few things. Maybe it's things like integrations with Active Directory or Entra or single sign-on, SAML, things like that from a login standpoint, or features, supporting inside plant, outside plant, fiber cables, whatever it happens to be. Um, Audits, things to think about. Do you need to do an audit to get the data you need for the system? Audits are, and you have two types of audits, right? There's the audit where you're hiring somebody to come in and do the audit for you. And then, of course, the audit from the standpoint of we're going to go do the audit. Now, you doing the audit, of course, you've got work day to day, right? So how do you fit that into your environment, timelines, and things like that? So, and then services, something you might discuss with the vendor or some other vendor outside of an audit, maybe services to help you get started, to actually do the documentation, to import data, whatever it happens to be. I think in terms of services and how or what you might want to do. So these are things just to think about when with respect to sort of getting started. Um, so this is talking about sort of building one level at a time, locate, inventory, connect, trace, and operate. Um, so after you define the scope and you kind of start to get into these things, if you've decided, okay, we're going to do a network documentation project, this kind of speaks back to a certain extent the audit, but if you do have the data already in some system, then some of this is easy because you're not going out and auditing. You are just taking data and possibly manipulating it to import or just using it as a direct connection or data source. But locating things, whether it's buildings and sites and logical or in the inventories. I'm not going to go back through this. I mean, it's somewhat obvious, some of these things. So um, usability is important with respect to whatever tool you pick. So you want to, again, I think it's important to go out and check out some different vendors, do the demos, get an idea usability, whether or not you demo the project from the standpoint of doing hands-on, like they provide you a system to play in, or you install the software beforehand before purchase. That's kind of up to you and how you do it. But I think understanding and having, is it usable for what I need to do? My tool may not be the right fit for everybody. I like to think of it as that way, but that's not true, right? People have different needs, they have different requirements, and we have software that fits, certain criteria for people, and for other people it may not. So usability, you want to, vet what it is you're looking at from a documentation software standpoint if you are choosing, software that's out there. But how is it going to work for you? So document assets so they can be found. From a best practice standpoint, if you are using a tool that's visual and hierarchical and things like that, it is nice to be able to sort of emulate your referred to as built environment. So, building out floors and rooms and other things, being able to get to an object and where it lives and what rack unit it is and things like that. But don't do that to do it. Do it because it makes sense. I mean, I have some customers where, especially like outside plant, they're like, well, for our project, we need to know where the fiber cable terminates in the building, like to a patch panel, LIU, whatever the device is, the end device is, but they don't want to go through the process of building floors and rooms and all those things. So they don't, right? They're just like, okay, we're just going to stop right here at the building or right in the building. The rest of it can either come later, or for this group and this department and their needs, that's it. and that's what we're going to stick with. And that makes sense, right? So you do what you need to, but don't feel compelled like you have to do all the things like on this sheet. I mean, yeah, is it probably best practice to have that information? Sure, but in with respect to time and energy and effort, gotta sort of you know pick and choose your battles, so to speak. So um, inside plant sort of standards. So this is speaking to obviously inside plant documentation, which is typically things like inside the buildings or huts or whatever infrastructure you have where something's inside. And usually it encompasses things like racks and cabinets and devices and patch panels and so on and so forth. Again, the cabling side of the house you may or may not need to do right now. Maybe it's really literally just about the cabinets and capacities of racks and things like that. Or maybe it's about power, right? Maybe you want to know where the PDUs are, what PDUs you have, and the connections to your PDUs from devices. Those are things you're going to go back again to the top with respect to this, which is really the talking about the scope, right? So I'll go back to that the scope conversation. Outside plant. So outside plant again. Outside plants typically outside the buildings, right? Usually it's related to fiber cable. It doesn't have to be, but I have to say most of the folks I speak with, it's about fiber cables. It's about strands. It's about running new fiber and capacities and being able to track 24s and 144s or 2000 strand count, whatever it happens to be, single, multi-mode, whatever it is, right? Now, with that said, there are certain things you may or may not care about. You may be like, well, buildings are great. I got a million poles, but maybe you're like, I don't really need to show the poles because I don't have necessarily splice cases in every pole. But maybe you need to show it with respect to paths. So that just again comes back to scope. The routes, what's the path that the fiber takes? That can come down to things like defining circuits and that sort of thing. Conduits, duct banks. Do you need to show or want to show conduits? Again, that some of those things come back to, do you have data or do you have to go do an audit? So that's why, again, limit your scope in the beginning to what makes the most sense and maybe even based on the data that you have, which is always kind of a good thing. So, one of the things I didn't really talk about is if part of the project, like with respect to fiber inside plant or outside plant, you want to do tracing, you want to see the full end-to-end connectivity. End-to-end connectivity can be require a bit of work because in order to get full end-to-end connectivity, of course, you need to have good data in the system. So speaking back to scope, I mean, if that ultimately is what you want to get to, I need a project where I'm delivering fiber cables and strands and connections building to building and understanding what paths I have, what capacity I have. Can I deliver new connectivity between two buildings? That speaks back to being able to do tracing, but to do tracing, you really have to get into the weeds. You have to get down to port level typically and cables and splicing and all those things. Just keep that in mind. That's usually a bigger project. So, tracing your services in minutes, so to speak, as opposed to sending somebody out in the field and saying, oh, is there a path here? And then they have to go kind of resurrect all the documentation, right? And I think this is probably, well, not quite there, but naming things. A lot of folks get caught up in naming conventions. I'm not saying they're not important to network documentation. I mean, if you're getting switches and routers and things like that, that should be your DNS names anyway. They're unique. Usually it's in a system already, IPAM or your DNS hosting system or whatever it happens to be. So, those names should be just kind of there. Things like buildings and rooms. Buildings should be whatever you normally refer to a building as. Hopefully, you're not calling every building, B1 or something, right? Usually they'll have a format. My experience with like universities and campus environments that are like large commercial operations, running building plants, things like that. Usually they have specific names for the building, so just stick with that. Especially if they're unique and people understand. you don't want to go renaming stuff that people aren't going to be familiar with, right? You go in and say, well, I'm going to call these buildings B101 when everybody refers to it as the engineering one building. So call it that. Don't try and reinvent the wheel for naming things. I mean, if you have a tool, it's got the ability to search, you should be able to find things pretty easy. If you have a hierarchy built, it's usually pretty easy to find where things are from that standpoint. Um, when you get into like naming your cables, yeah, maybe you have a naming convention there because you want to know the start and the end device, how it's connected. But I don't put too much weight on the naming scheme. I think it's important to think about, but also, don't reinvent the wheel if you already got namings. Role-based views. This is just a report just showing kind of different information. I think the point of this is, you know, one of the things you think about in terms of is, do you have people that can see certain data and not other data, or certain locations, things like that. So something to think about with respect to best practice. Read-only users versus editors versus, the type of user that can get into the system and what they can do. Being able to have audits and that sort of thing. So, you have different folks that might want to see information a certain way. Usually, I view this more as giving people access, but limiting what they can do in the system, right? It's not so much about a view. I don't really care if the CIO sees everything, but I certainly don't want them to be an editor necessarily because they probably don't have experience in the software to start with. So if they want to double click and drill down and see things, that's great. But I don't want them pressing buttons to edit or add. Usually that's a dangerous path to go down. So, it's people with experience doing that. So, um, this is just sort of a recap. Um, confirm outcomes, baseline, validate, operate. Again, I will go back to my initial thought, and the thing I've talked about most is really kind of scoping out what it is you want to do. Don't try and do too much, right? Know thyself. Stick with what you know and what you know you can get done in the time you have. Most people don't have time for documentation. That's why it kind of falls by the wayside. But unfortunately or fortunately, it's honestly, very important to making decisions day in and day out with respect to these IT networks that we have. So just keep that in mind. And with that said, graphical networks, we do make a software product. So if you want to see our tool at some point, I'm sure we'll reach out to you. I think we're going to send you this. We have a Word document PDF we'll send out. It has to do with basically all the stuff I talked about in a little more detail. And if you have questions or other issues, please let us know. If you have any questions, let us know as well. And with that said, I will stop my share and see if there's any questions. I don't know if anybody else on the team had anything to add. Fred, if you wanted to wrap this up.
Jason, so thanks for this.
Yeah.
So what would be like, I guess, like the number one headache, or I guess people afraid to start this endeavor?
Time. It's always
Time.
time.
Yeah.
It's always time. I think the biggest, people always ask us like, who's your biggest competition and all these other things. And yeah, we have competitors. Sure. We all compete against each other. That's good. That's good for everybody as a whole because it makes us better. But really the competition is time. It's I won't say apathy because people want to do documentation. It's really just time. How do you get time to do it? They're worried about how much time is going to be involved with doing it. That's why I go back to scope your project so it makes sense for what you really want to fulfill. Try and get your most bang for your buck. If it's, again, capacities of fiber cables and strands, just focus on that core. And maybe it's very specific things like, I just want to know from between these two or three sites what I have capacity wise with respect to fiber. You don't have to be like, oh, I have to do everything. No, man, just start with what you think will be helpful in solving a problem, right? And again, I mean, I have some customers that's about power. They want to know, hey, do we have two PDUs? Are they plugged in to all the equipment so they have separate sort of power lines? The power is separated. We want to document that and make sure that we stick to that. But maybe that's the project, right? Or again, could be fiber, could be rack and stack. don't include cable. So it's going to come back to time, and you have to think about the level of effort. Because I will say this too, the other thing about this, and I should have mentioned this. I meant to add this into my document, which is process. One of the other things about this, besides scope, is the process you're going to follow at the end. If you're not going to put a process in place to keep your documentation up to date, I'll tell you right now, don't start it. There's no reason to. Your documentation will be out of date in no time, and no one's going to use it. And it's going to be just like all the other stuff you have. So you really have to put that sort of commitment in. And I'll mention with respect to commitment, it's not about just getting the money, for a software product if you have to go buy something. It's also about getting commitment from the boss or the boss's boss, because if they're not behind the tool, again, it'll die a pretty quick death. Us vendors we really don't want to see that. I don't want you to come to us and buy our product, and then in a year you're like, nope, I couldn't use it, or they didn't want to re-up, or for whatever reason, because of time and that kind of thing. I'd rather you not get started. It's not That's not why we're here. We want to give you a tool that you use for many years and have it fulfill a problem, right? Anyway, it's my two
Right.
cents. Sorry,
It's all right.
my
And
soapbox.
so like network documentation, like for customers or people that are looking for a better way to visualize their network topology maps,
Mhm.
instead of drawing up by hand, there are a lot of
Yeah.
tools out there have some type of network discovery that could be a good start for that
Yep.
type of project.
Yep. Network discovery can be good. Doing SNMP, that kind of thing. Most people already have network monitoring tools that do SNMP. So we try and leverage and tap into that to a certain extent, because, then you can turn it into network documentation, so to speak, because
Right.
discovering devices is not really documentation. That's a monitoring tool, right? We're specifically for that. To your point, yeah, the discovery side of the house can be a good starting point for people and save you time. The integrations can save you a lot of time. We do a lot of integrations with things like ServiceNow and SolarWinds and other tools, asset management tools, and so on. And they help you automate. They really do. They can automatically get new data, update data, and it's the changes are just happening behind the scenes, and you're not having to constantly update data. That goes back to my thoughts about process too.
Right.
Building things into a process.
Great. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so automation is helpful for a
Yeah.
lot to keep these documentation up to date. And for the outside plant parts, I know we talked a lot about outside plant today as well. Now, a lot of the fiber is you can't automate the finding of that. So, how do
No.
most customers that don't have anything documented, how would they, what would you suggest for them to get started?
Well, I would definitely, go back to whatever data sources you think you might have. KMZs, if you had Google Earth, use a Google Earth, use a KMZ to import data. You might have Esri, you don't even know it. Maybe there's a group at your facility that has Esri that's already documenting the buildings and manholes and things like that. Go leverage that data, KMZ, or an integration with those tools to bring data from those systems. So you really want to think broad and think about other departments and who might have data out there that you're just not aware of because they're not part of your group or your team, right? So see where you can leverage data as best you can. Otherwise, you got to do an audit, and that's time consuming and can be costly. And sometimes you just got to do it. But if you are
Right,
going to go down the path of an audit, make sure you have a tool and a process for the future, because you don't want to. That's a lot of money to waste and not start to really build up your documentation from it. So,
right. All right. Thanks.
yep.
Anybody here have any questions,
Let's see. Got a minute for any.
comments?
Yep. We'll be reaching out to you guys. We'll send you some literature and kind of go from there.
All right. Well, thanks, Jason, so much for doing this.
That
Thank you,
was
everybody,
fun.
for your time.
Yes, thanks,
Thank you.
Jason. Thanks for attending, everyone. I'll just look out for your inbox. I will send you some documentation about this webinar.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Bye bye.
All right.
Bye.
Take care, everybody.
Organization types, right? Municipalities and airports, universities, hospitals, utilities, hotels, etc. So the one thing we all kind of have in common, especially in business, is networks, right? It's how we, you know, live and breathe anymore. We have some sort of network behind the scenes. Even at home, we have small networks. in our businesses, whether it's a small business or very large business, there's usually some network infrastructure behind the scenes that somebody needs to know something about. Sometimes those are managed infrastructures, sometimes they're self-managed, sometimes they're a mix of both. But either way, sometimes documentation can be helpful, and I do say sometimes because maybe not always. So, why do we document? We partly to get answers to questions, right? Um, getting a level of detail about our infrastructure that can help us out from in day to day, right? So we look at things as what exists, where is it, how's it connected, who owns it from a networking standpoint. And then you consider things like your audience. Why do you document? Well, because you might have an audience that requires it or needs it. Maybe it's the CTO or CIO or the leadership at the company. Maybe it's engineering or the knock and just field workers in general. Or there's other reasons too. You might have to fulfill some requirements because you do a lot of processing of data, and they may require you to have some network documentation. Could be anything from your insurance company. Because you are saying that you have a secure network, they want to know at least have some documentation and some other things around that. So, you build these types of things to go with it. So, what to document? That leads us down the road of, we talk about network documentation, but ultimately, what is it that we want to document? Um, so again, that's going to lead to really my next slide, which I'm going to talk quite a bit about, which is the scope of network documentation. So when you say we need documentation or we need to document our network, that's all well and good, but you really have to define what that means scope wise. I mean, ultimately down the road, you may be like, hey, I want to document everything. I want to have a complete as built environment in my network documentation. Um, so an as built would be how is everything basically physically connected together in some tool that I can refer to and understand what my network looks like without having to actually go out in the field necessarily. But that's a lift that most people can't do, certainly not in the short term. So we have to look at the scope. What is it that we want to do with our network documentation project? So one thing we look at is business decisions, and that's usually based around what I like a lot of people refer to. It's about the pain, right? What is the pain that we have that we want to try and solve with network documentation? That can mean different things to different people. It can be things like capacity planning from the standpoint of fiber cables and strands, capacity planning around rack elevations, capacity planning around things like power. So you look at your infrastructure, you look at, hey, where are we having certain troubles, and is the network documentation going to help us with respect to that? And if it is, then that's kind of your core focus you start with. If it's capacity around fiber cables and strands, then let's focus on that to start with. Yeah, of course you might build it out over time, but we need to define the scope of the project, and that I think is very important when you start a project, because that also will sort of dictate who you're going to get involved into the project. Because if it's fiber, maybe it's a smaller list of folks that you are really going to be dealing with internally, as far as the documentation project goes. So you sort of define that scope and you say, okay, this is what we want to do. It's inside plan, outside plan, or even just logical drawings. What do we want to do? Let's define that scope. Because that leads to other questions and other things you got to think about, which is things like the boundary. The boundary are things like if I'm a university, my boundary might be my campus. Is it all campuses or one campus? Is it all the buildings or just a couple core buildings? Things like that. That's what we kind of term boundary. It doesn't have to be physical. It doesn't have to be like a map, although it sort of makes sense when you talk about something like a university campus. Maps make sense because you have campus buildings and things like that. But it could be other boundaries. It might be boundaries like if you're doing logical drawings, maybe it just has to do with routers and switches and core infrastructure around those types of things, or VLANs or subnets. Again, just depending on how you want to define it. With respect to things like fiber, outside plant, then that boundary again could be a map. Usually with outside plant, you're dealing with maps because you want to show fiber, sort of how it traverses. You don't have to do that, but that's usually pretty common from that standpoint. But also the boundary is things like not just the sites or the buildings, but also you start to get into a hierarchy, although the tool you pick may not be a hierarchical tool and it doesn't necessarily have to be. Uh, but you might be thinking in terms of buildings and floors and rooms, routes, services like we have up here, domains. What's in scope for the project? What we're thinking in terms of, those that again, what I defined as a boundary. And then there's asset classes, manholes and handholds. Are we defining circuits and power, those sorts of things? So with outside plant, my experience has been a lot of folks, what they really want to do are the fiber cables, usually the path that the cable follows, possibly the conduit the cable is in. If we do splicing, we want to know probably the splice case that's being used. Where is the splice case? Is it in a manhole or a handhole, or is it above ground? Is it on a pole? Those types of things. So that's some of the asset classes, especially with like outside plant. When you look at inside plant, it might be switches and routers and racks, pretty common. But what about cabling? Those types of things. So you start to ask your questions again. That's why I'm talking about scope so much, because it's very